Доброе утро, уважаемые коллеги.
Now, good morning, dear colleagues. I can see that you are entering the hall just now, so please take your seats. My name is Igor Baranov. I'm a dean of the Corporate University of Sberbank, and I would like to start our conference with a lecture of Andrew Scott, Professor Andrew Scott. Just a few words about Professor Andrew Scott. Now, first of all, Professor Andrew Scott is working with us, has been working with us for 5 years in our top management training program. This is the program that we do together with the London School of Business. Professor Andrew Scott is a renowned macroeconomist with an international reputation. Before LBS, he worked in Oxford and Harvard and the London School of Business. He, for many years, was the provost for the educational work. He did all the educational programs, apart from being the fact that he is a great professor, and I know that, and because I studied in LBS in his macroeconomic course, and he is also a renowned researcher. He writes articles about fiscal policy, about monetary policy, but this year a book was published by him. It became a best-selling book. It was written by Edel Cretan about 100-year life. And what are the implications of the longer life expectancy would be, how the financial institutions should change and the social system should change to respond to these challenges. So we invited Professor Scott, and he accepted our invitation, because this area of active life, of a longer active life, of changing jobs during this active life, is obviously very much related to continuous learning. So it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Professor Andrew Scott.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Sorry, is the mic working? Yeah? Okay, very good. I'm a professor at London Business School, and I confess I'm a macroeconomist, which normally means I'm looking at what happens at a country level. But what I've been working on recently is the theme of longevity, looking at the concept of how extending lifespans are changing how we structure our life. And I've been interested in this topic for a long while, because as an economist, I kind of focus on the future. I focus on the short-term future, what's going to happen to exchange rates and GDP, but also the long-run trends, the trends that year by year accumulate and change the way we live, what firms do, indeed which firms are out there. And so things like globalization or technology I've been talking about for a while, but I've always had this big interest in longevity. Because if you look around the world, in every country, life expectancy is increasing. And we're getting to levels of life expectancy which we've never seen before. And I've always felt that in much of the discussion about longevity, there's been the wrong focus. There's always a focus about aging and of being old. But what is happening is we've actually got more of life, and we're actually younger for longer. So what I've been interested in is how, with this extra time, we need to reshape the way we live our life. If you look back to the Industrial Revolution was the last time that as a society we changed how we structured time. We structured a three-stage life of education, work, and then retirement. We created the concept of a weekend and a working day. And we've used that structure of time right the way through to the current period. But what I want to show you first of all is the extraordinary increases in life expectancy are happening. And then I'm going to try to argue that that means that a three-stage life is no longer viable. The length of life that people can now expect to live means a world of education, then one long work span, and then retirement no longer functions. And so I'm going to suggest that we need to have a multi-stage life, one with several different stages to our lives and different careers with different aims and motivations. Now, once you start to think about the reshaping of life, it's clear that this is a trend that is going to change everything. Okay? It's going to change how we work, how firms see their employees. It's going to change marriage. It's going to change what people do at every age in life. Let me give you a few statistics to show you how this is already making an impact. If you look at people in their 20s, they're behaving very differently from what they used to do. I have a picture of my father, aged 14, and he's wearing a suit and tie. He's got a job. He's paying rent. He's married at 17, he's got a child at 18, and he has a house at 19. That's an extraordinarily early age to take on adult responsibilities. I have a picture of me, 23, 24. I look younger than my father at 14. But sort of 25, 26, I took on those responsibilities. I had children, I bought a house. But then when I look at my children, who are currently between 19 and 25, I can't see them getting married, having children, buying a house for a long while. In fact, the average age of marriage now, first-time marriage in the US and the UK, is now 30. The average age of having a child is 31. First child. In the UK, for the first time ever, you're now more likely to have a child in your 40s than you are at under 20. That's an extraordinary shift. So something is happening. We invented in the 20th century teenagers, but in the 21st century, something is happening in the 20s. People are behaving very differently. Then I look at what is happening at people around my age, and I'm 52, but in the 40s and 50s, I see more and more people taking career breaks or shifting their direction. If I look at people who are in retirement, I don't see retirement happening in the same way. The idea that there is a single age, 65, where everyone comes to a hard stop, has gone. Now there's almost 3 stages to retirement. One where people carry on working, either in the firm they used to work for, full-time or part-time, or either they start something different and move into somewhere else, or they do community work. That's the first stage of retirement. Then there's a second stage, which is where people are fit and healthy in their 70s, and they want to travel and do things. Airbnb have just appointed some interns. They've got an average age of 76. But Airbnb is very interested in this 70-year-old market. It's their fastest growing demographic. Then, of course, there's a more traditional third stage of retirement where life is hard and one is physically frail. But everything is beginning to change. My own favourite statistic to demonstrate the effects of longevity is that in the UK, divorce is on average declining. But there's one age group which is seeing very, very rapid growth in divorce, and that's people aged over 80. Over 80 is seeing a big growth rate in divorce. It's a bit of a trick number because it starts from a very low base, but I can't think of a better number to demonstrate the effect of longevity than people getting divorced more in their 80s. It's both a function of how long people have been together and how long they still have to go. So this is going to change everything, but of course one of the things it really is going to change is education. Because we structured a 3-stage life heavily based around the notion that you finished your education at 21. And I'm going to show you some numbers that suggest that people being born today will have to work to their late 70s or early 80s. And I can't think of much you can learn at 20 that will still be relevant aged 80. And if you superimpose on this all the technological changes that people say are coming, it's clear that we're going to have to rethink heavily adult education. And that adult education is going to have to be of many different types. Some will be just updating people with new facts, new knowledge, and new information. But others is going to have to be much more transformative. And so we're going to have to think about how we start providing new types of education, new products, new providers for new purposes right the way through people's careers. So I'm going to spend most of my time just establishing how Linda and I, this is co-written with my colleague Linda Grattan. She's a psychologist, I'm an economist, so it's kind of an interesting combination of perspectives. What all this means, I'm going to go through the core framework and then hopefully perhaps we can get some questions. Please do feel free at any time to ask a question. It's much more fun for me when that happens. So let me just begin with some data. I'm an economist. I do like data. And these are the conventional statistics that you often see, government data on life expectancy. The reason I'm showing you these numbers is actually because they're wrong. They underestimate what is actually happening. And I make that claim not because of some weird science fiction freak or bold medical claims, but there's an assumption that's made in all of these government data that misses something really important. But anyway, here's the main government data that people focus on, showing you life expectancy trends going forward in time. You've seen an increase. The increase is expected to continue, but we're still talking about high 80s in about 100 years' time. This increase in life expectancy is a global phenomenon. It's not just seeing in the rich countries, you're also seeing it in the emerging markets. But of course, emerging markets start from a lower level, but their growth is faster. Just like their GDP, they are catching up with the rich countries. Let me also stress that these are averages, and averages are very misleading. There's an old saying, if you have one hand in a pot of boiling water and one hand in the freezer, on average you're doing okay, but clearly you're going to be in a lot of pain. So averages can conceal a great deal. And there are some, particularly in the US and UK, some big differences between what's happening to rich people and what's happening to poor people. Russian trends are, I'm afraid, different. So here we have an average for the world and what's happened to Russia. You can see that obviously the economic and political turmoil of the 80s and 90s led to a lot of volatility. But if you look at what's happening more recently, you can see that the upward trend in GDP, the greater political stability, is once more leading to an increase in life expectancy. And so Russia is forecast, like every other country in the world, to see its life expectancy continue to increase. And obviously because it starts at a lower level, it has more scope to catch up with other countries. Now, most of the focus on this longevity is all about how many old people there's going to be. Let me say I try very hard not to use the word aging. It's not because I want to be like Peter Pan and live forever. I want to grow and be wise and mature, etc. But aging is a very bad word to use. Because, first of all, it has negative connotations. No one really likes to age. And immediately it starts to get people in a negative, pessimistic tone of thought. They immediately go to thinking about end of life. And I'm talking about longevity and all of life. The second problem with aging is it's a very ambiguous phrase. Because everyone's aging. It doesn't matter whether you're 1 year old or 99 years old, everyone's aging at the same rate, 1 year a year. The other thing is that if you look at people, it's clear that actually as you get older, age is a less useful indicator of people's abilities. The range of activities and fitness varies. And that's because people biologically age at different rates. There's a lot of research about aging, and there's some interesting findings going on. And one thing they've found is a correlation between the length of what are called your telomeres and your length of life. Telomeres are the ends of your DNA strands. If you think of a shoelace with plastic coverings at the end, the plastic coverings are like the telomeres at the end of your DNA. And people with long telomeres live longer lives. Their DNA strands are protected for longer. Now, we don't know if that's just a correlation or causation, and you can imagine the excitement of some medical researchers trying to say if we lengthen telomeres, we'll lengthen life, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. By the way, how do you lengthen your telomeres? Exercise, eat well, not much stress. You know, the normal things tend to correlate with lengthy telomeres. But you know, if you look around some people, they look good for their age, others look old. You know, I'm really 20, I just look very old, and my telomeres must be very short. And so everyone ages biologically at different rates. And of course, psychologically, people age differently. So I try and avoid the word aging, because I think it starts immediately to get the wrong sense of what is happening here. What is really happening is not that there's more old people, but we're aging more slowly, and I'll try and show you some proof around that in a moment. But the most traditional way of looking at aging is this, which is for the first time ever in human history, we're about to see more people in the world over 65 than under 5. That's clearly a sort of a big change for humanity when there's more people aged over 65 than 5. Now, here's the work I want to try and focus on. It's the result of a well-known demographer called James Voelpel. And he's done something very interesting. He has constructed a series called Best Practice Life Expectancy. And by best practice life expectancy, I'm not talking about the oldest person to live. By the way, does anyone know the oldest person ever to have lived that we can formally prove? Anyone know what age they reached? 120, yeah, very impressed. 122 years and 164 days. A French lady called Jean Clément, who died in 1999, so a while back now. So we know that 122 is humanly possible. I was at lunch the other day and there was a Russian bio entrepreneur next to me who's just announced a $1 million prize for the first person to reach 123. So if you fancy earning $1 million, there you go. He thinks it's going to motivate people to look after themselves and get to 123. I think I'd rather have the money before I reached 123, but there we go. So what is best practice life expectancy? Best practice life expectancy is the country that at any moment in time has the highest average life expectancy. Okay? So he's constructed this data series, and here it is. Goes back to 1840. In 1840, the country with the highest average life expectancy was Sweden. Today it's Japan. Probably quite soon it'll be South Korea. Now, best practice life expectancy, as I say, is the country with the highest average. So the assumption here is there's nothing genetically different about Russians and British people and Japanese people that means that if we have the same diet, the same medical support, the same lifestyle, we won't live to the same lifespan. Okay, so that's the concept here. And what Voelpel's research shows is truly striking. It shows that in every decade over the last 150 years, life expectancy has increased by 2 or 3 years every decade. Now, I find this an amazing statistic, but whenever I sell the audience, they seem less impressed than I do. But that's a remarkable constant trend. Over the last 150 years, in every decade, life expectancy has increased by 2 or 3. I often ask people, how many of the audience have actually thought about how long they might live for? And about a third of people put their hand up, which is interesting. And then I say to people, well, how did you form your guess of how long you might live for? And they often say, well, I looked at my grandparents or my parents, which is sensible because genetics is important. But if this is true, and you look at your grandparents as a gauge for how long you might live for, you could be out by nearly 20 years. Because if every generation is 30 years apart, that means every generation is living 6 to 9 years longer than the previous generation. Your children could live up to about a decade on average more than you. You could live about 20 years longer than your grandparents. So by basing yourself on your grandparents, you're going to be underestimating your likely lifespan. Let me try and put this chart a different way to try and give you the implications of what is happening with longevity. This trend says, it's a bit like saying at the end of every day, here's another 6 to 8 hours. That's what this chart says. Every day, here's another 6 to 8 hours. And if I were to say to you, the day is no longer 24 hours, but 32 hours, I think you'd go, great. Okay? What am I going to do with that extra time? The first thing most people say is sleep, but I don't think you spend the entire time sleeping. I would restructure my day. If my day was 32 hours and not 24 hours, I would do things differently. Now, from this analogy, I think you can already start to see what's going to happen because we can structure it in lots of different ways. My preference would be to get up earlier, and I'd go to bed later, and I'd have a sleep in the middle of the day. And I wouldn't have 3 meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'd probably have 5 meals, hopefully smaller meals. And I would probably want to get my work done in the morning, and I'd have my leisure time in the second half of the day. But I would restructure my day. We've structured a 24-hour day in a way that works for us individually, nutritionally, and also in a way that's coordinated with everybody else. if we go to a 32-hour day, we would restructure it differently. I don't think we would just stretch it out. We wouldn't just say, right, let's make the working day from 8 till 7 and have a longer gap between breakfast and dinner. That would not seem optimal to me. But kind of that's what's been happening at the moment with this growing longevity. We say, right, we designed a life for 70 years, let's just stretch it out to 100. And that just doesn't work. We need to structure time in a different way. So this is where we get to the essence of what I'm talking about. We tend to think of time as something the physicists talk about. You know, the British physicist Stephen Hawking has a book called The Brief History of Time. But I'm a social scientist, and I think time is a social construct. We choose how to structure time. And in the consequence of a 100-year life, we're going to structure it very differently. In the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution and a 70-year life led to the concept of a 3-stage life: education, work, retirement. And that second stage of life was a sort of a linear career path. That is about to get changed dramatically because of this increase in life expectancy. There's a statistical point I'm about to make. The numbers I showed you at the beginning on life expectancy, they're wrong because they don't forecast forward this trend. Okay? Most governments' main estimates of life expectancy assume that that progress just ends today. In fact, they assume that a child born today in 2017 lives their life entirely in 2017. In other words, that baby on the left, a newborn baby in 2017, when they reach my age, 52, the government assumes in calculating life expectancy that they will have the same life expectancy at 52 as I do today. But of course, they're going to reach 52 in 52 years' time. So they're going to, according to the chart we just seen, have another 10 to 15 years on my life expectancy. And that's missing from those central government projections. So we've got to make a projection forward of this life expectancy trend, and of course this is where there's lots of different views. Some argue that it's about to slow down dramatically because of problems of obesity, diabetes, and this terrible opiate problem the United States has got. And that may well be true in some countries, because I don't think anyone would say the US has got a best practice life expectancy. You know, if you've got a medical system that gives everyone addictive opiates, that's not best practice. So we're looking here at the average of best practice, and that's likely to carry on increasing. And then the question is, well, what rate will it carry on increasing? Will it carry on increasing 2 to 3 years every decade, or will it start to slow down as we start to approach 120? There's a group of increasingly optimistic medical researchers who argue we're about to see a massive increase in life expectancy, expected to grow faster than 2 or 3 years every decade, because medical research is now beginning to focus on aging. There's a move to classify aging as a disease, which of course means you can cure aging. They're starting to focus on a theory of why cells age rather than look at your heart, your lungs, or your stomach. And they've made some progress. If you're a flatworm, they can extend your lifespan by 6 times. Humans are a little bit more complicated, of course. So many people argue we're about to see this massive improvement in life expectancy. But all I'm going to show you now is what happens if we just assume that that trend of the last 150 years continues for the next 30, 40 years. And the results are quite striking. I have them here for the G7 countries. And it says that a child born in Japan in 2007 has a 50% chance of living to 107. A child born in the UK has a 50% chance of living to 103. This is simply extrapolating that trend. Even if you think that trend is going to slow down, you can see it's still the case that children being born today have a very realistic probability of living to 100. They have to plan for a 100-year life. Now, how many of you, by the way, know someone who's 100? Okay. So that's kind of what I would expect. A few hands go up, because the people who live to 100 today are really exceptional. They've got great genetics. And they've reached 100, but they haven't had to plan to reach 100. It's been hopefully a pleasant surprise for them. But the generation coming through will have to think seriously about living a life that goes to 100. No wonder they're not in a rush to start work at 21. One of the motivations of this book was my middle son, who was just finishing university. And he said to me, "Dad, I'm not going to look for a job next year." I was furious, really cross. But then I thought about it and thought, well, why would you? Okay. One of the reasons I was furious was I was jealous. I was working in a bank at age 21. And much as I'm sure that was good for my career, etc., perhaps if I had a longer life, I wouldn't have been in such a rush to get started. So what we're seeing, of course, is this big increase in the number of people living over 100. 100 plus is the fastest growing age group. This is, if you're British, your year of birth and what your life expectancy is like. And what I normally try and do, by the way, in this lecture is two things. The first is get people to leave thinking they're going to live for longer than when they arrived, which is quite a nice way of spending the morning. The second thing is I try and get people to think about their life in a different way. Because if you're living to 90 or 100, wow, that's going to have some implications. And by the way, there's no magic pill here. You don't take a pill and live to 90. You have to work on it. There's a lot of things behind this. Let me try and tell you some of the implications about this. And I think this is really important. Society over the last 100 years has become very numbers-based. We used to have a concept of age based upon what people could do. But now we categorize people by age. You're 21, you go to university. You're 65, you retire. 50, you're getting old. The trouble is, those numbers, it's a bit like inflation. They're misleading. So if I said to you 20 years ago what was the price of a bottle of beer in Moscow, that number wouldn't be very meaningful to today's comparison. And that's how I feel about age. So this chart here, I'm showing you if you like, an adjustment for inflation. What does it mean to be old? So in 1922, if you were a British male and you were age 65, you had a 4.3% chance of dying in that year. Okay. Today, if you're 65 as a British male, you have a 1.3% chance of dying. That's a tremendous, two-thirds reduction in mortality risk. But in 1922 was kind of when pensions were introduced. Been going for a while. 65 was the retirement age. 65 was old. There weren't many people aged 65. So what is today's equivalent of 65 given this change in mortality rate? Well, there's two ways of looking at that. One is to say, okay, today's 65-year-olds have a 1.3% chance of dying. What age would someone be in 1922 to have a 1.3% risk of dying? And the answer is 51. So 65-year-olds today are the equivalent of people who are age 51 back in 1922. The other way of looking at it is who today has a mortality rate of 4.3%? And the answer is 78-year-olds. So 78-year-olds today are kind of the equivalent of 65-year-olds in 1922. So I'm trying to say here that sort of 65 isn't the same as it used to be. 65 is no longer old. 78 is now the equivalent of 65. That, of course, has interesting implications for working, because if you index retirement and mortality rates, you'd say the retirement age is 78. So if you're in your early 40s, you have a lot more work to come than you've done already. How's that for a thought? Education is going to be quite important, isn't it, in your 40s, because you're going to need a lot more skills to make sure your career prospers for the next 30 years. So here's the real punchline behind this. Ignore the first 20 years of your life and ignore the last 10 years of your life. And I'll give you some time in the evenings to sleep. I'll give you some time at the weekends and some holidays. Everything else I'm going to call productive hours. If you live to 70, you have 125,000 productive hours. If you live to 100, you have 220,000 productive hours. In other words, that increase in life expectancy means you have another 100,000 productive hours. And the question, ladies and gentlemen, that society has to answer is, what do we want to do with those 100,000 productive hours? How much do you like your current job? Do you want to carry on for another 100,000 hours? And even if you do, can you carry on for another 100,000 hours? With the technology coming along, will you just get replaced with artificial intelligence, or whatever it might be? So this, I think, is the key slide. We have a lot more time. Just stretching out what we've always done doesn't seem to make sense. We won't have the skills, we won't have the enthusiasm, we may not have the ability to carry on. This is where we lead to this multi-stage life concept. Now, because I'm an economist, I like to think of things in terms of an asset framework. So an asset is something that provides a flow of benefits over a long period of time. And you can spend time investing in your assets, building them up, but if you don't invest in them, they deplete, they deteriorate. So what Linda and I started to think about was, how would we want to structure a 100-year life to make it a good life? And that's what we're trying to do here. We structured a 3-stage life because it brought out the best of 70 years, given the needs of industry and given the needs of society. But how can we structure a 100-year life? So we thought about these assets. So we have 2 categories of assets, tangible and intangible, and the tangible ones are kind of financial. So they're your savings, your pension, your house value. And by the way, when I normally give this talk about length of working career, everyone always goes to think about their finances. In fact, there's normally a point in the talk where I just lose everyone, because I can just see they're thinking about their pension, they're thinking about their savings, they're thinking about their children. They're not listening to me. And then they start to come back and eventually listen to me again. So finances are, of course, important, and I've got some bad news for you, I'm afraid. If we're living for longer, you either have to work for longer, save more, or spend less. Okay? There's no way out of that conundrum. There's one of those, you have to do one of those 3 things. Now, if I look at most people, saving more doesn't work. Yeah, people aren't really saving enough for a 70-year life, let alone a 100-year life. So that suggests we're into the territory of working longer. Now, on the right-hand side of here, we have the intangible assets, which we think are really important and often sort of not much focused on. And we think there's 3 types of intangible assets. One is what we call your productive assets, which of course this group is going to be very interested in. This is your skills and knowledge. And your skills and knowledge are of course what you learn at university and school, but also on the job, in-job training, but also what you learn from your peer group. Your peer group is a very important part of how you learn about your profession. And we need to keep investing in that. Of course, in a 3-stage life, massive investment in the first stage, but not much in the rest of life. The second intangible asset is your vitality assets. Now, these themselves are made up of 2 parts. One is your mental and physical health. You know, are you happy? Are you fit? And of course, the longer you work, the more stressed the work is, the less happy you are, the less fit you are. But also in your vitality assets are your relationships, your close relationships. And these are crucial. I know I'm an economist and I should talk about GDP, etc. But if you look at study after study of lifetime happiness, you get a very, very clear result. Sure, money makes people happier, it doesn't make them happy. The thing that makes people happy over their life is, to quote the Grant study, the capacity to create room to love and be loved. It's investing in those close relationships. So vitality is critical for a good life. And then the final intangible asset is one which we think has not been of much importance in the past, but will increasingly become important in a multi-stage life, and is, I think, a really big one for lifelong education. We call it your transformational assets, your ability to create and deal with change. Now, in a 3-stage life of education, work, retirement, you may not have to go through much change. You know, if you're in one job with one firm for your life, that's not a lot of change. But if you have to change job, change sector, change firm, change marriage, whatever it might be, you have to go through a process of change. And some people are good at that, others aren't. In reading up about the book, I came across the very powerful concept, anthropological concept called liminality. Liminality. And liminality is the point where you're in between stages. You're in the middle of a transition. You're no longer what you used to be, but you're not yet what you're going to be. And that plays with our identity. We don't like it. We're not comfortable. And for the majority of people, it's very uncomfortable. So we have all sorts of social rituals to help people get through that in terms of adolescence, for instance. But we're going to have to get used to that in a firm as well, because we're going to have to go through more transitions and more transformations. I used to be doing this role, now I'm doing this role. I used to be the senior manager, now I'm working part-time as a consultant. All of those require a sense of identity that is not tied into the role I'm doing or the education I'm doing. Another example of transformational assets, which I think is really important, and this, by the way, is a key part of education. Education brings together in a community different types of people, bonds them together, and helps them do the transformation. And that's a very powerful thing. But of course, we have to be exposed to new ideas. So this key part about transformation is being exposed to new ideas. On our website, which is listed here, there's a diagnostic you can do to sort of assess how you're doing on these assets. And one of the things that comes out very clearly is men of my age tend to be very bad at transformational assets. So if I look at my friends, I'm very lucky. I have a lot of very good friends. And we have a great time. But we're very similar. Roughly the same age, we do roughly the same job, we have broadly the same interests. That's why we get on so well. But if I need to change and get a new idea, that's not the group to go to. And if I want support as I start to develop new ideas and new ways of doing things, they're not going to be very supportive, however much they like me, because they like me because I'm like them. They don't want me to change. So supporting people in going through these shifts of identity is, I think, a very important part of life. Now, if you think about these four assets and what's going to happen over 100 years, this is why we need to re-engage with a multi-stage life. Let me very quickly try and go through some slides. What I want to try and do now is just tell you about people's length of career and how it's going to change because of this longevity. I'll go through it rapidly. So we invented three characters. The first is called Jack. He lives for 70 years. And the point of Jack is to show how a three-stage life with retirement at 65 works very well when life expectancy is 70. I'm going to show you three different characters, each with different life expectancies, and I'm going to look at how much they have to save if they want to retire at 65, given their life expectancy. And they're going to try and save to achieve a pension worth 50% of their final salary. Okay. Now, if you look at Jack, Jack can retire at 62 and have a pension worth 50% of his salary if he saves 4% a year. Really very comfortable. Because for every 5 years of work, Jack has got 1 year of retirement. Then there's Jimmy. Jimmy is currently 46. We've given him a life expectancy of 85, but if you look at the data, it's probably 95. So actually, Jimmy's problem is worse than we're making out here because we didn't want to make it look like we were biased. If Jimmy wants to retire at 65 and is living to 85, Jimmy needs to be saving 17% a year of his money, which people just don't save that much. So Jimmy can't retire at 65. In fact, we do the calculations and suggest that Jimmy's going to have to work till 71, 72. And if you look around the world, you're seeing more and more people working after the age of 65. It's the logical solution. This, of course, is creating a big issue for lots of firms, because how do they meet that demand for continued work? Because often the continued work is not of the same form as before. People want something less time intensive. Then there's our dear friend, the millennials. I don't like these generation labels. I find them deeply misleading. I find there's far greater variation across the generation, within the generations and across the generations. So I don't like them. But I think longevity may help explain something of what is happening and why we want to mark the millennials out as different. Because if you're living to 100 and you want to retire at 65, you have to save 24% a year of your money. And there's no way people are going to save that much. In fact, when we do the maths, we think Jane is working to 79 or 80. She has a 60-year career. We said to the publisher, should we call the book a 100-year life or a 60-year career? They said 100-year life. We think it's more positive. But just think, if you are 21, my son at university, why would you rush to start a job? I've got a 60-year career. I'm going to have some fun, first of all. I'm going to find out who I am and what I like. And certainly when I start that job, I'm not interested in long-term promises of what's going to happen in 20 years' time, because I've got a multi-stage career coming up. I'm not going to be with you for the duration of my career. I've got to have a much broader perspective on what I do. And this led me to think, in finance theory, you can buy options on a share. So you can buy a share or you can buy options on a share. And when you buy an option, the value of the option depends on two things. The first thing is kind of the volatility of the underlying share. And the second thing is the length over which the option is held. And that got me thinking about longevity, because if you're living for longer, options become more valuable. My father would no doubt look at my children and say they lack commitment. You know? They're not committing to a firm, they're not committing to work. But I would suggest that they're actually spending time investing in options. They're discovering what they're good at, what they like, and then later they will commit themselves. It's interesting, for instance, that the rate of divorce is coming down in general because people are marrying later. They know more about themselves and how to deal with things. And we're seeing, I think, a similar thing with, say, graduate recruitment. Going back to my son, who told me he wasn't going to work for a couple of years, I was very anxious because when I graduated, if you didn't get a job straight away, and then you tried to get a job in 2 years' time, it was a problem. Look at your CV and say, well, what was wrong with you? You know, were you not committed? Do you not like work? Was it a medical problem, a mental problem? It was held against you. You fell out of lockstep. And my son said, Dad, no, it's not like that anymore. And I said, Louis, it is. I'm a business school professor. I know what I'm talking about. But of course, he proved me wrong completely, because he just started 3 years later on the graduate program of a major consultancy firm. He's 24. He's the youngest person on the graduate recruitment program. The oldest is 31. This is kind of just weird. But you know, this is this new stage, and what is happening, people are behaving differently. In Brooklyn, in New York, in Shoreditch, in London, you're seeing a whole group of people in their 20s having a different lifestyle. They're sort of, I would say, playing at work. They're earning just enough money to cover their needs financially. They're doing all sorts of interesting things like pop-ups. You know what I mean by pop-up? It's a phrase where you just start up a little business for a couple of weeks and then it closes down. It's a weird form of entrepreneurship because you're building into its beginning its demise. The whole point is it's pop-up. It's going to disappear. It's just here for a month. And I think that's really interesting because these aren't building for the future, they're learning. They're learning some skills, they're being innovative, and then come their early 30s, they're going to want a job. And they're going to come to big corporations and say, hey, here I am, I want to earn some money now. But they're kind of interesting and entrepreneurial and innovative, but they're completely unhouse-trained. How are you going to blend those with your 21-year-olds straight from college? Okay. There's some data which we talked about already. So let me come back to these these four assets. The standard response by governments and corporates is to try and extend the three-stage life. As people are living for longer, you're seeing governments push back retirement age. That, to me, seems wrong. Because if you stretch it out over 60 years, that's a miserable thought. And you go back to these intangible these assets. It's true, working to 80 will solve Jane's financial problems. She'll be fine financially. But what about her productivity assets? If she just carries on working to 80 and she learned nothing since 21, her productivity assets go to zero. She's not going to be productive. She's not going to probably keep her job. She's going to have to reinvest at different stages in her career in her productive assets. Then you think about vitality assets, your mental and physical health and your relationships. A 60-year career doesn't, to me, seem consistent with good mental and physical health or with building up lifelong friendships or good relationships. You're going to have to take breaks in your career to recharge physically and mentally, and sometimes have parts of your career which are less focused on money and more about work-life balance. And that, of course, then leads into the importance of transformational assets, because if I'm going to have 3 stages to my career, one about money, one a better work-life balance, one perhaps putting something back into the community, I'm going to go through a lot of transformations that I need to prepare for. People always underestimate how difficult those transitions are. So we need to redesign life. We're going to see whole new stages of life. I'm speeding up because of time. So there's 2 things that are going to become important. The first is what we call juvenescence. Okay? So if you're going to go through many changes in life, you need to be good at transitions. And adolescents are good at transitions. But as we get older, we get habits. We have fixed views, fixed opinions, and we like certain ways of doing things. We're comfortable. I talk very much about myself here. That's difficult if you're going to have to change your identity and change your role. So we're going to have to be more juvenescent. We're going to have to be more flexible as we get older. The other thing that's going to be important, and this is going to be a very complicated thing for HR departments, is we'll see the end of lockstep. I said at the beginning that society has become very age-based. 21, you're at university. 31, you have children. 61, you're looking at retirement. And we use that within corporates in a major way to think about people's needs and incentives. In a three-stage life, there's only one way you can sequence things: education, work, retirement. In a multi-stage life, where I may have three careers, one about money, one about work life, and one about a community, I can arrange it in different ways. I could do the work life first, then I could do the serious money, and then I could do community, or flip it all around. So we're going to have people of different ages at the same stage of life. You could be an undergraduate, and you could be 21, 41, or 61. You could be a senior manager at 31, 51, or 71. At 71, I used to be a senior manager at 51, now I've got a more junior position. That's going to be very complicated to deal with, both individually and also within the corporate. We're going to start to see, of course, several generations coexisting in the workplace. You're going to also see, by the way, a lot of new challenges in the workplace. You've probably heard of the sandwich generation, the notion that you have children, parents, and grandparents. Well, with a 100-year life, you're going to see the club sandwich generation. There's going to be 4 generations: children, parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. And we're going to have to develop whole new social obligations as to who's responsible for who. What is the role of grandparents? They look after the great-grandparents or the children? Do the parents look after all 4 generations? We need to find solutions to this. Within the company, we're already seeing lots of these things occur, but you can see some of the new HR issues that are beginning to arise. I've talked already about graduate recruitment as a fuzzy concept. How do I onboard those 30-year-old creative entrepreneurs? If people want to carry on working into their 70s, I need to de-link pay from age. One of the problems is as people get older, they still want their pay to rise, but their productivity may not be improving. So firms get rid of those older workers. We need to try and do something to break that link. I've talked already about the need to delay retirement or provide options at retirement. If someone's got a 60-year career and they know that they may be spread across 3 or 4 different sectors, what do you teach them? Can you really tell them this is what you need to know? Or should they individually curate their own L&D experience? Rehiring senior managers in junior roles, and of course, very important, the mid-career break option. More and more companies are not offering pensions, but a great way to retain people is say, you know what, after 20 years, you can take a year paid leave, and we'll keep your job open and come back. We're seeing more and more firms begin to do that. Whole new industries are going to be created. In the Industrial Revolution, we created leisure, and we created a leisure industry. Football clubs, the cinema, the music halls, museums, etc. We're now seeing, I think, the invention of a new form of leisure, which is not the recreation industry, but the recreation industry, where people will spend their leisure time investing in themselves. That may, of course, be going to the gym. It may be going on a 6-month rebooting life camp in Mexico or somewhere, or it could be actually just taking a coding boot camp and learning Python and R or becoming a web developer. We're seeing a whole bunch of new industries which aren't just about watching Netflix in your spare time, but it also investing in your capacity to help you with this transformation. Let me try and summarize. I'm going to have a little bit of time for some questions, if there are, from the floor. I began this and said this is about restructuring time. The last big restructuring was Industrial Revolution and the creation of a 3-stage life. We're seeing people think about pushing back retirement, but they're always focusing on end of life. As I gave you that example, when the day goes from 24 hours to 32 hours, it's about the whole day, not just the end of the day. And so I want you to think about longevity as being about all of life, not just end of life. And it changes everything. Slowly, but it changes everything. And I hope through the data I've given you and the examples I've given you, I've explained that this is already a process that's ongoing. And like all those long-term trends like globalization and technology, it builds up bit by bit. You can't point to 1 year and say, yeah, everything changed in that year, but you look back over 20 years and go, wow, we do things differently now. And this is going to happen. This is the story of the next few decades. So what do we have? Given these life expectancy trends, people will have to find work into their 70s or 80s. That's a big challenge. And of course, there's a tendency to focus on people who are well-skilled and well-resourced, but it's going to be a huge social challenge for those with less skills and less resources. It means that how our parents live their life is not going to be a great guide to how we live our lives or how our children will live their lives. This is a big social experiment that's going on. And by the way, the more I give this talk, the more I come across different people. And what I find more and more is that people in their 60s and 70s are doing things differently. People in their 20s and 30s are doing things differently. But the 40 and 50-year-olds who are in control say, no, 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 we've got to carry on doing things the same way. It's a kind of a big tension within the workforce as far as I can see. Now, I've focused on longevity, but clearly there's going to be new technologies, so there will be whole new jobs and new skills, which make the concept of a multi-stage life and retraining all the more relevant. The natural tendency is to think about getting your finances right, but remember those other intangible assets, your productivity assets, your vitality assets, and your transformational assets. They're the ones you really have to think of in supporting a good, long life. If we just respond to longevity by working the same way for longer and longer, that doesn't seem to me a good life. By the way, the data's interesting. If you do manual work, the longer you work for, the earlier you die. If you do non-manual work, the longer you work for, the longer you live. So a sense of engagement, identity, and purpose is very important to longevity. Life will become multi-staged. That means transitions become the norm, and we always underestimate transitions. Transitions are difficult. They need to be prepared for in advance. New stages of life will emerge, and that will seem puzzling to older people such as myself. Recreation, not just recreation, has to be a big focus. Lockstep comes to an end. Stage is no longer age. Options become more valuable. Remember, we are younger for longer. That's what's actually happening. Today, 65-year-olds have the mortality rates of 51-year-olds from several decades ago. We do still age, but we age more slowly. The arc of life has been extended. This is going to create whole interesting issues at home. So for instance, if I have a 60-year career and I have one stage is about making money, one work-life balance, and one about community, my partner will have a similar structure. We need to coordinate who does what when. So we've got whole new social contracts to work out that we've never had before. Generational complexity is enormous because loads of firms assume that when you reach 57, you retire. But if you're going to carry on for longer, how do I promote people? If there's a pyramid structure in my organization, people here staying on for longer blocks people here. That's going to lead to some generational fights, but also need to think about how we monitor progress, not just in a vertical direction. And then the coming HR battle, there's a standardization around age that the three-stage life encourages. If I'm right about this multi-stage life, the way people want to work and how it varies over their life is going to change enormously. There's going to be a great deal of complexity. And one of the big strategic issues firms are going to have to do is, do they try and give in to that flexibility, or do they focus on standardization? And you can probably see what the answer is going to be there. In those firms where talent is most important, customization will be the approach. In those firms where talent is less important, there'll be more of a focus on standardization. So that's the 100-year life. If we really did have a 32-hour day, I'd carry on for a bit longer, but we do have a little bit of time if anyone would like to ask some questions. I haven't got a headset for translating the questions, but any questions? Yeah.
Yes. My name is Kirill. Just a question. I know most of us wants to live longer, yeah, and probably Russia is always exception in your life. And But the question is, for example, taking Russia, I know a lot of people, even my parents, they were born, my father was born in Russian Empire before
Yeah.
the revolution. And his sister in 2009, father 2013. They were died 93 and 97
Wow.
respectively. So, and I would say they are not exception for the people who were born at that time. So in Russia, a lot of people,
Yeah.
of course, during the Second World War and
Yeah.
the Soviet Union turbulence, and we had a huge lockstep in Soviet Union.
Yeah.
But why this paradox? I have my personal opinion, but what do you think? Why is that?
Well, you'll probably know more about Russia than myself. But what I can tell you is that what is really important for longevity is the nutritional intake of the expectant mother. So if you are born in a time when food is scarce, so the war would be a great example, then it has a very big effect on lifetime expectancy. So that'll be one. Also, clearly medical support is going to be important, and social problems. And what is one of the... So let me give you an example in the US. You're seeing in the US at the moment, amongst white blue-collar workers, a really big fall in life expectancy, similar to what the Soviet Union went through. And when people lose their job or lose their identity and there isn't the social support, life expectancy plummets. So I think it'll be a combination of those two. I don't know if that matches in with your own theories. But
So they just were constantly talking. That is, they mentally, you shouldn't go for pension.
oh, yeah, absolutely. No, that's...
More personal behavior.
Yeah.
rather than,
No. To still be engaged and have some sense of purpose and identity is really, really important. And one way to do that is to work. One way is to be engaged in a community. Very, very important. Yeah.
Я не очень понимаю насчет гибких закадровых ресурсов.
I can't hear because she's not speaking to the microphone. Just let's wait for a second. All right. I do not understand very much what you mean by the battle for the HR resources. On the one hand, there's technologies and robots. There's less need for people. Industrial Revolution 4.0, manless management, manless procurement. But on the other hand, people are going to be living longer. But on the other hand, it means that people are going to be living longer and longer, and that means that there will be more labor made available. Why there's going to be battle? Because in a place where there's no need for talent, where there's standards prevailing, robots will do the job.
So longevity is a big topic. Technology is a huge topic. And I'm an economist, so I have a slightly different take on technology. I do worry, of course, about the speed of technology change. But there's never been a technology in the course of human history that makes us all have no jobs. It's always augmented our lifestyle. And what technology does is destroy jobs, but create new ones. And what's the problem, I think, with a lot of the technology arguments that you hear technologists talk about is they make two mistakes. The first is they exaggerate how quickly the technology is coming. Okay? It always takes longer to come than they think. Partly because there are flaws in the technology, and partly just it takes a long while to implement it. Here we are at Sberbank. It's a great company, but it's going to take them a while to properly implement all the technology. We've had driverless planes for 40 years. We still have pilots. So I'm not denying there isn't change coming, but it tends to come more slowly than we think. The second thing the technologists never get, and it's because it's very difficult, you can always see the jobs that are going to be destroyed, but not the jobs that are going to be created. So, 120 years ago, half of the population worked in farming or in domestic service. And those jobs went. But no one imagined all the office jobs that would be created. And you look at the titles of office jobs, it would have been ludicrous to someone 120 years ago to think that there will be these titles. My favorite example of this is Peter Thiel has a quote, the founder of PayPal. He says, "We were promised flying cars, but all we got was 140 characters." So, which I like. First of all, we were promised flying cars, we haven't got them yet. The technology happens more slowly. And who'd have thought that we'd form a multi-billion industry creating thousands of jobs around Twitter? You know, if someone said to you 20 years ago, yeah, it's going to be really important to have people whose job is to make something interesting in 140 characters, you go, why? And perhaps you still do, but I mean, it's sort of just, you know, it's very hard to see. So what's going to happen with technology is it makes some things no longer valuable. And if you look at what the data suggests, you know, if you think about a job is made up of many tasks. You know, most people have a job made up of tasks. And tasks are of two types. One requires cognitive ability, and one is non-cognitive. And the tasks are either routine or non-routine. Now, what we're finding so far is that computers initially got rid of the cognitive routine stuff, the back office stuff. Now computers are so smart, they're kind of being able to deal with non-cognitive, non-routine things, like driving. And they're coming for the higher-end cognitive routine stuff, the big data stuff. So sales, marketing, accounting, law, boom, a whole load of jobs are going to go in that area. But what's going to happen is that the jobs that will expand will be ones which are non-routine, the things that are harder to program, the things that require more of a personal touch. And they're the things that become increasingly valuable. The history of the economy is of things losing value because we find it easy to make them. So agricultural productivity is huge, the price of food comes down. We get better at manufacturing, the price of clothing comes down. So what becomes valuable is the stuff we're not good at making. And that tends to be the stuff that is not routine. So this is going to have big implications. Our jobs will shift away from certain tasks to other ones. So for instance, as a professor, the thing I hate doing most of all is grading. It is the most awful thing to do, grading. You think sitting exam is bad, try grading 500 of them. It's just terrible. But that is a routine cognitive task that a computer would do soon. And I welcome it. That's brilliant. But I don't think there'll be fewer professors. It's just the professors will now spend their time doing more non-routine things. And that's what's going to happen with the shift. Now, of course, people do lose their job in this process. And they have to find a new job, and that's not easy. They often see a fall in their income. They have to move their city. It's involuntary. It's a big social cost. But there will be new jobs coming on, and that's, of course, what we need to train ourselves for. But what the HR battle refers to is, so I think there'll still be demand for jobs. There'll just be certain types of jobs. But what the HR battle refers to is just how complicated work is going to be. Take retirement. People are going to come along and say, I don't want to retire. I want to carry on working. But I want to work part-time, not full-time. I want to have less responsibility. So there's going to have to be a lot more bespoke negotiations done at every age. Whether you're 20 or 60, you're seeing people trying to challenge the current process. That's the idea of the HR battle. Yeah.
So if the longevity grows and there will be more workforce on the market, so will this mean that the social problems will grow? So more unemployment, more homeless people, more poverty, social tensions, crime. So what social implications this would have?
So again, as a problem as an economist, both on technology and this one, there's a notion called the lump of output fallacy, that there's a fixed amount of work to be done, and so if some people are doing that work, others haven't got a job. But that's not true. So for instance, in the 20th century, we've seen a huge increase in the number of women in the workforce. We haven't seen a huge decrease in the number of men in the workforce. We just see more people work. Because as more people work, they produce more, they earn more, they spend more. So I don't think there's a fixed amount of work that just then has to be. So machines get rid of workers in general, or old people take away poor people's jobs. There are some interesting issues here, because if we are working for longer, we're going to be more productive over our lifetime, which should be good news for the economy. But I think, you know, if this is multi-stage life, our average productivity may be less each year. We're going to work for longer, but we'll have more time off while we're working. So that'll be, I think, where the HR complexity comes in. I think there will be there already are social problems which technology and longevity are creating. One is inequality. The rich live a lot longer than the poor. So I've shown you these averages. In the UK, there was a terrible fire recently in London. in a council building where a lot of people died. Terrible tragedy. In that area, life expectancy is 20 years less than an area 1 mile away, which is a rich area. So the gap between the poor and the rich is 20 years of life expectancy. That's wrong. That's very, very wrong. That's a social tension. Technology will benefit the rich, not the poor. That's already causing tensions. And then, of course, what you're beginning to see is, as people work for longer, the young are struggling with careers or struggling to buy houses, and there's an intergenerational tension that's beginning to build up. So there will be social tensions. We are seeing growing inequality, so we have to deal with that. But I don't think this is about the old denying the young jobs. Yeah, time for one more question, and I'm afraid I'll have to go for another session, so forgive me.
Boston Consulting Group. Thank you, Professor Scott, for raising important issues. Piggybacking on the last question, I want to ask your opinion on the environment and sustainability.
Yeah. So one of the problems in looking at a 100-year life is, you know, if you think about the next 100 years, wow, everything's going to change. I guess it's a good month to think about the last 100 years and be in Moscow, because you look at how life has changed in Russia over the last 100 years and all the things that have happened. Impossible to predict or to imagine. And sometimes, you know, if I do an exercise with groups, I say, imagine someone being born today, how they're going to structure a 100-year life. And of course, it's an invitation to get involved in all sorts of science fiction and, you know, they're living on the moon in some cases. So I haven't talked much about the environment here because it's just another huge issue. I talk about technology, but clearly if I think about globalization has changed the world the last 30, 40 years, technology has changed it the last 30, 40 years, and deregulation. If I look at the next 30 years, longevity, technology, sustainability, and re-regulation are going to change everything. And so I haven't talked much about sustainability, but yeah, and this has a lot of implications for how we plan cities, because we're going to have more old people living in cities, and we need to design cities in a different way. But of course, sustainability also demands that we design our lifestyles in very different ways. So, yeah, it's important, and I've ignored it, not because it's not important, it's just too complicated. Thank you very much for giving me. I do have to go. There is a website which has lots of free material in English, I'm afraid, and the book is in 13 languages, but not yet Russian, but hopefully we'll do something about that. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Уважаемые участники, очень большая просьба не уносить с собой приемники синхроперевода. Спасибо большое.